The military officer looked at James Brown like he was crazy. "Mr. Brown, we're advising against this trip. The Viet Cong are active in the area. We had mortar fire last night. This isn't a Bob Hope Christmas show where everything's secure. This is a combat zone." James looked at the officer without blinking. "Those boys are over there dying. The least I can do is give them a few hours where they forget about that. I'm going." It was June 1968, and James Brown was about to do something that even the military thought was too dangerous. He was going to perform for troops in Vietnam during the height of the war. Not behind safe lines, not at a secure base far from fighting, but at Da Nang where you could hear gunfire in the distance and mortars landed close enough to shake the ground. Vietnam, 1968. The war was at its peak. The Tet Offensive had shocked America just months earlier. Casualties were mounting. Anti-war protests were exploding across the United States. And in the jungles and rice paddies of Vietnam, young American soldiers, most of them barely 20 years old, were fighting and dying thousands of miles from home. James Brown was 35 years old, and at the absolute height of his fame. "Say It Loud, I'm Black, and I'm Proud" had just been released. It was controversial, powerful, and exactly what Black America needed to hear. James was selling out everywhere. He could have stayed home, stayed safe, stayed comfortable. But James had been reading the letters, soldiers writing to him from Vietnam. Young black men, mostly telling him what his music meant to them, how they'd play his records in the barracks, how they'd sing his songs before going on patrol, how "I Got You" and "Papa's Got a Brand New Bag" reminded them of home, of dancing, of life before the war. One letter stuck with James. It was from a 19-year-old private named Marcus Johnson from Augusta, James's hometown. Marcus wrote, "Mr. Brown, I'm writing this from a foxhole outside Da Nang. Tomorrow we're going on patrol, and there's a good chance I won't come back. I just wanted you to know that your music is the last thing I want to hear if I don't make it. You made me proud to be black before the army taught me to be proud to be a soldier. Thank you for that." James read that letter 3 times. Then he called his manager. "Book me a tour. Vietnam, I want to perform for the troops." His manager thought he was joking. "James, you don't need to do that. Bob Hope does the Christmas shows. Let him handle it. I'm not waiting until Christmas, and I'm not performing where it's safe. I want to go where the boys are, the ones in the real danger, the ones who need it most." The Department of Defense was contacted. At first, they loved the idea. James Brown wanting to perform for troops was a publicity goldmine. But when James specified he wanted to go to active combat zones during the war's peak, they got nervous. "Mr. Brown, we typically schedule entertainment during lulls in fighting. We set up secure bases far from combat. What you're proposing is dangerous. That's why I'm proposing it. Those boys don't get to wait for lulls in fighting. They're out there every day. I'm going." After weeks of back and forth, the military relented, but they made James sign waivers. They couldn't guarantee his safety. If something happened, if mortars hit, if Viet Cong attacked, if a sniper opened fire, they wouldn't be responsible. James signed everything. June 15, 1968. James Brown landed in Saigon. The heat hit him like a wall. Humid, thick, suffocating. This wasn't concert venue air conditioning. This was jungle heat, the kind that soaked your clothes in minutes. They gave James military fatigues to wear. "You'll be less of a target if you don't stand out," an officer explained. James, who was used to wearing the sharpest suits and shiniest shoes in show business, put on the olive green combat uniform without complaint. The first stop was Da Nang Air Base. It was one of the major US military installations in Vietnam, but it was far from safe. Viet Cong regularly launched attacks. Mortar rounds landed on or near the base, almost nightly, and the surrounding area was contested territory. You didn't go outside the wire without expecting trouble. 5,000 troops were gathered for the show. They'd set up an outdoor stage, just plywood and speakers, nothing fancy, no elaborate lighting, no backstage area, just a stage in the middle of a combat zone. James stood backstage, which was really just behind a canvas tent, and looked out at the audience. 5,000 young men in combat fatigues, most of them exhausted, many of them carrying the 1,000-yard stare of people who'd seen too much. A large number of them were blacked. The army was disproportionately black in 1968, with black soldiers serving and dying at higher rates than their white counterparts. An officer approached James. "Mr. Brown, we've got reports of Viet Cong activity about 2 miles from here. We're monitoring the situation. If anything happens, we'll evacuate you immediately." James nodded. "What about the boys, sir? If something happens, what about these 5,000 soldiers? They're trained for combat, sir. They'll handle it." "Then I'll handle it too." The officer tried one more time. "Mr. Brown, you don't have to do this. We can reschedule for a safer time." James looked at the officer. "Son, these boys don't get to reschedule. They're here every day. So I'm here today, at 1900 hours, 7 p.m. military time." James Brown walked onto that plywood stage in Da Nang. The response was instantaneous and overwhelming. 5,000 soldiers erupted, screaming, cheering, some crying, because James Brown, the godfather of soul, the hardest working man in show business, had come to them. Not to a safe base, not during peacetime, but here, in the middle of the war. James grabbed the microphone. "Good evening, Vietnam." The roar that came back shook the jungle. "Y'all know why I'm here?" James asked. "I'm here because you're here. Because you boys are out here fighting. Because you deserve more than letters from home and sea rations. You deserve to remember what it feels like to dance, to move, to be alive." And then James launched into Papa's Got a Brand New Bag. The band, AIM, military band, that had learned James's songs specifically for this performance, kicked in behind him. And for the first time in months, maybe years, 5,000 soldiers forgot they were in a war zone. They sang, they screamed. Black soldiers were on their feet immediately, but white soldiers, Latino soldiers, Asian American soldiers, everyone was moving, because James Brown's music transcended everything. In that moment, they weren't black or white or rich or poor. They were just young men who missed home and needed to feel something other than fear. James performed for 2 hours. He did all his hits. He did the spins. He did the splits. He gave them everything. He would have given an audience at the Apollo or Madison Square Garden. The fact that this was a plywood stage in the jungle didn't matter. The fact that he was wearing combat fatigues instead of a sequin suit didn't matter. James Brown was performing, and that meant he was giving 100% about an hour into the show. James heard it. A low boom in the distance. Then another, mortar fire. Not close enough to be an immediate threat, but close enough to hear. Close enough to know it was real. Some of the soldiers tensed up. They recognized that sound. That was the sound that meant someone was about to die. That was the sound that meant take cover. James kept performing. He didn't even acknowledge it. He launched into "I Got You, I Feel Good," and danced harder. The message was clear. We're not stopping. We're not giving fear the satisfaction. The commanding officer approached the side of the stage, ready to call the whole thing off. But then he saw something. The soldiers weren't taking cover. They weren't panicking. They were watching James Brown. And because James wasn't afraid, they weren't afraid. Or at least, they weren't showing it. The mortars continued in the distance. Maybe 3 miles away now, based on the sound. Maybe an attack on another position. Maybe just random harassment fire. But they kept coming. Boom, boom, every few minutes, and James kept performing. Get up, offer that thing. Sex machine. Say it loud. I'm black, and I'm proud. When James sang that one, say it loud. I'm black, and I'm proud. The black soldiers in the audience went absolutely wild, because that song meant something different to them. In a military where they faced discrimination, where they died at higher rates, where they came home to a country that still treated them as second-class citizens, that song was an anthem. That song said, "You matter, you're important, you're proud." James saw their faces. He saw young black men crying and screaming those words. And James stopped the song halfway through. "Hold on," James said to the band. They stopped playing. 5,000 soldiers went quiet, confused. James looked out at the audience. "I want to say something," he said. "I look out here, and I see a lot of brothers. Black men fighting this war, and I know, we all know, that when you'll get home, you're not gonna get the respect you deserve. You're gonna face the same discrimination you faced before you left. Some of y'all are gonna come home to neighborhoods that still don't want you, to jobs that won't hire you, to a country that still sees you as less than." The black soldiers nodded. They knew. They all knew. "But I want you to know something," James continued. "You are not less than. You are heroes. Every single one of you. Black, white, brown. I don't care. You're over here fighting when you could have found a way out. You're risking your lives for people who don't appreciate it. And that makes you the best of America, even if America doesn't always deserve you." The place erupted. Not just the black soldiers, but everyone, because James had named the truth. He'd said out loud what everyone knew, but nobody talked about. James pointed to a group of black soldiers in the front. "When you get home, you walk with your heads high, you demand respect, because you earned it here, in this jungle, in this war. Nobody can take that from you." Then James turned to the whole audience. "And that goes for all y'all. Every single soldier here. You're the real heroes. I'm just the entertainment. You're the ones putting your lives on the line. Don't ever forget that." Another boom in the distance. Closer now, maybe 2 miles. The commanding officer was getting nervous, but James just smiled. "You'll hear that? That's them trying to interrupt my show. Let's show them they can't stop James Brown." And he launched back into Say It Loud. The show ended at 2100 hours, 9 p.m. 2 hours later, James was supposed to leave, get on a helicopter back to Saigon. But the soldiers didn't leave. They crowded around the stage. They wanted to shake James's hand. They wanted to thank him. They wanted one moment of connection with someone who reminded them of home. James stayed for 3 more hours. He shook every hand. He signed every autograph. He listened to stories about girlfriends back home, about hometowns he'd never visited, about fears these young men couldn't tell anyone else. A young black private from Detroit approached James. He was crying. "Mr. Brown, my brother died here 2 months ago, stepped on a mine. He was 18. I'm 20. I got 6 more months in country. I don't think I'm gonna make it." James grabbed the young man's shoulders. "What's your name, soldier?" "Private Davis." Jerome Davis. Jerome, listen to me. You're going to make it. You're going to survive these 6 months. You're going to go home to Detroit. And you're going to live a long life. You hear me? How do you know? Because your brother wouldn't want you to give up. Because you're strong enough to be here. Because I'm telling you to make it. And you're going to listen to me. Jerome nodded, tears streaming down his face. Yes, sir. James never saw Jerome Davis again. But 30 years later, in 1998, James received a letter. It was from a man named Jerome Davis. He'd survived his 6 months. He'd come home to Detroit. He'd become a teacher. He'd raised 3 kids. And he'd never forgotten what James Brown told him that night in Da Nang. James performed at several more bases during his Vietnam tour. Every show was similar. Dangerous conditions, mortar fire in the distance, soldiers who desperately needed a few hours of normalcy. And every show, James gave everything he had. When James returned to the United States in July 1968, reporters asked him about the trip. Was it scary? Was it dangerous? Of course it was dangerous, James said. But those boys live with danger every day. I lived with it for 2 weeks. That's nothing compared to what they're going through. Why did you go? Why risk it? James thought for a moment. Because somebody had to show those boys that people back home care, that we see them, that we appreciate them. Bob Hope does Christmas shows, and that's great. But I wanted them to know that in the middle of the war, in the middle of the fighting, somebody was thinking about them. Somebody was willing to risk something to bring them a few hours of joy. Would you do it again? In a heartbeat. Years later, Vietnam veterans would seek James out at concerts. They'd tell him they were at Da Nang, or one of the other bases. They'd tell him that night saved their lives. Not literally, but spiritually. That they were at their breaking point. And James Brown showed up and reminded them what they were living for. One veteran told James, "I was ready to give up. I didn't think I could make it another day. Then you showed up in the middle of a combat zone and performed like it was Madison Square Garden. If you had that much courage, I figured I could find enough courage for one more day. Then one more, then one more. And eventually, I made it home." James Brown never served in the military, but the soldiers who were in Vietnam in June 1968 considered him one of their own because he'd come to them when they needed it most. In the jungle, with mortars firing, with death nearby, and he'd given them the one thing they needed: hope. If this story of courage, service, and showing up when it matters most moved you, hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Share it with a veteran who needs to know their service mattered, or with someone who needs to be reminded that real courage means going where you're needed, even when you're scared. Have you ever done something dangerous to help others? Tell us in the comments. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more incredible stories about legends who risked everything for people who needed them.